drummed his fingers on the table, a familiar sign that he was displeased with his partner. So poor Tilly had been supplanted by a dazzling charmer who had not even had her first season, Lady Aileen Dunbar. Tilly had always been rather scornful of frilly, fussy and twittery girls like Lady Aileen, but she had to admit that she did envy her during the royal visit, and not only because of the king's flattering attention to Lady Aileen, but because of the interest shown to the silly girl by none other than the Marquess of Heppleford. The Marquess was designed like a Greek god, with thick, fair hair, sleepy blue eyes, and a classic profile. He was just over 6 feet tall and was accounted to be the finest shot and huntsman in all of England. Tilly, who was a keen huntswoman herself, longed for the handsome Marquess's notice. But no, he only had eyes for Lady Aileen. Rats! Tilly moodily kicked at a piece of manicured turf and turned her mind away from that particular worry to another. How on earth had her father managed to pay for all this magnificence? An extra wing had had to be built to house the royal servants. The library had been wrenched apart and rebuilt as a bowling alley to pander to the current royal fad. And then there was the food. The lobster, the quail, and the rare vintage wines, the champagne. Since the departure of King Edward, her father had been closeted for long hours with his steward, only emerging from the estate's offices for meals. And each time he seemed to have grown older and more worried. But to all Tilly's anxious queries, he would only conjure up a thin smile and ruffle her carroty curls and say, "Don't worry, my son. We shall come about." Lord Charles could be forgiven for often forgetting that Tilly was not a boy. She had faithfully dressed and behaved like the son he had always longed for, with the sad result that the marriageable young men of the county referred to her as a good sport, and her former girlfriends who had lately blossomed into ribbons and bows and whispers and giggles now shuddered and said Tilly smelled of the stables. Tilly set off on her rounds of her tenants, trying to banish the feeling that she had woken up on this spring morning to find that she was, well, somehow odd. She briefly wondered what her mother, who had died when Tilly was a baby, had been like, and then pushed that thought aside as she headed for the South Lodge to inquire after the lodgekeeper, Mr. Pomfret's weak chest. Mrs. Pomfret looked none too pleased to see Tilly, as she was surrounded by stacks of clothes, waiting to be ironed, and had 3 small children clamoring and clutching at her skirts. But nonetheless, she dropped Tilly a low curtsy and replied politely that Mr. Pomfret was coming along remarkable. "I told him he shouldn't have been out in that damp weather we had," said Tilly. "I shall bring him some of my own medicine from the still-room." "Well, I don't know, but that what the doctor's given Fred ain't the best thing." "Nonsense," said Tilly brusquely. "I know what's best for him. I'll bring it along tomorrow. Goodness, I'm parched. Any chance of a cup of tea?" "Of course, miss," cried Mrs. Pomfret. "I'll put the kettle on." Tilly stretched out a booted foot toward the hearth with a sigh of satisfaction. Mrs. Pomfret made very good tea indeed. It never crossed Tilly's mind that Mrs. Pomfret had more to do with her time than make tea. Tilly had been treated like visiting royalty by the tenants and the servants for as long as she could remember. Like many of her peers, she had fallen into the habit of believing that she alone knew best what to do for them. She enjoyed living her tenants' lives for them, and genuinely believed she was bringing a little glamour and excitement into their mundane existences by her frequent visits. There was the rattle of carriage wheels on the gravel outside the lodge, and Mrs. Pomfret turned around with a cluck of dismay, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'd better go open the gates, seeing as how Fred is poor."